While soldiers were off fighting our enemies in Europe and the Pacific, other Americans at home did their part to contribute to the war effort. They sacrificed their time and resources to ensure that V for Victory was more than just a slogan. In this video, we'll concentrate on these home front efforts and those impacted most by them. When the United States entered World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, one of the quickest changes occurred in American industry. Factories that once made cars and refrigerators now made bombers and munitions. To streamline this process, the government took over some aspects of industrialization. The Office of War Mobilization created a list of production priorities and controlled raw materials. The Office of Price Administration regulated civilians' pay and controlled wages and rations for goods like meat, sugar, gas, and tires. The Office of Research and Development hired top scientists and thinkers to improve technologies that could be useful for the war, such as new surveillance electronics and medical advances. Most of these industries were managed under the supervision of the War Production Board, which was established in early 1942 to make sure that goods for the war effort could be continuously produced. Additionally, the war saw a temporary suspension of all labor union strikes under the Connolly Anti-Strike Act of 1943, so that workers themselves wouldn't cause production of important war materials to slow. But as we already know, war is an extremely expensive endeavor for any country. The mass industrialization for the war effort in the Second World War was no exception. To cover the cost, the government increased the income tax, which was automatically deducted from workers' paychecks, and sold war bonds, which were essentially a loan to the federal government from the people. But Americans weren't necessarily inclined to follow these policies on their own free will. While it's true that most Americans gave of their own finances and time for the cause of the war with little need for prompting, the government also spent large amounts of money on propaganda advertisements that included posters, songs, videos to be shown at the start of movies, and news bulletins. These advertisements, put out by the Office of War Information, were usually posted as gentle encouragements to conserve resources, stay alert to strange activity, and do all that one could to aid in the war production effort. Individual experiences during the war were by no means the same. Despite the obvious need to work together, minorities still experienced intense levels of discrimination at home and at work. For Japanese Americans, the war was especially brutal as they were considered untrustworthy faces of the enemy. As was the case in World War I, African Americans seeking industrial jobs left the South and moved to the North and West. Nearly 1 million African American men also left home to serve in the military. But the need for more workers and soldiers did not mean that their experience was easy. Race riots continued to happen in cities across the nation, and Black troops often found themselves in low-ranking military positions and in segregated units. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen, whose job it was to provide protection for large bombers flying into Europe, often worked with planes left over from World War I and received little recognition or support. In another example, African-American soldier Vernon Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross after single-handedly removing 3 machine gun nests, 2 observation posts, and 2 bunkers. It wasn't until Bill Clinton's presidency that Baker was finally awarded with the honor that he deserved, the Congressional Medal of Honor. This continued discrimination led to the adoption of a campaign called Double V for Victory. This played off the original V for Victory campaign that was going on nationwide, but insisted on victories, 1, against the enemy in Europe and the Pacific, and 2, against prejudice at home. At least one of their domestic victories occurred when President Roosevelt, threatened with a protest march on Washington, issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination in the government and in jobs that received federal funding. The actions of African Americans both at home and abroad during World War II continued on after the war, fueling the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In addition to African Americans, many Mexican Americans flooded to defense industries, and over 300,000 served in the military. The government also allowed Mexican farm workers to come to the United States with relaxed immigration restrictions to help during agricultural harvest seasons. This flood of Mexican immigration led to increased resentment of white farmers towards Mexican immigrants. Many of the white farmers had only recently made their way to the West Coast as a means of escaping the Dust Bowl, and saw Mexican immigrants as a threat to the few jobs that were left available in agriculture. Independent of this resentment, but occurring at the same time, was a growing obsession with jazz, especially among teens and young adults. As part of this new trend, young men began dressing in outfits called zoot suits, which had accentuated shoulders, a narrow waist, and ballooned pants. Young Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants began donning these outfits, which encouraged a sense of swagger and confidence. For white Americans, the newly confident, or at least what seemed to be confident, class of minority men and women was a threat to their social order. In June of 1943, these tensions broke into violence in what is called the Zoot Suit Riots. The violence continued for days and was a defining part of the Mexican-American experience in World War II. While Native Americans played a role in pretty much every American war since the arrival of European colonists in the 17th century, their role in World War II played a significant role in keeping thousands of American soldiers safe overseas. Nearly 25,000 Native American men left their reservations to serve in the military, and thousands more worked in industrial jobs. But a small number from the Navajo tribe played an especially important role. Because the Navajo language was so difficult to learn and almost impossible to understand without training, it was used as a code for radio communications. This was better than a mathematically generated code that could be broken by a computer and provided a secure way of sending important classified messages overseas. The men who transmitted, received, and translated these messages were known as the Navajo Code Talkers. Upon returning to the U.S. after serving in the war, many Native Americans took advantage of veterans' benefits, including cheaper housing and free education through the GI Bill. And while some returned to the reservations to assist their families, many left that lifestyle for good. Women also contributed significantly to the war effort. In addition to the over 200,000 women who served in the Women Army Corps, or WWII, in non-combat roles, over 6.5 million women rushed to fill industrial jobs vacated by men serving as soldiers. The popular image of Rosie the Riveter comes from this dramatic upsurge in female working force. And while the government spent millions of dollars in advertising to convince women that their role in the war was significant, they were still paid well below what their male counterparts received, an issue that would serve as fuel for the women's movements in the 1960s and 70s. One of the least discussed groups during World War II are Japanese Americans. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 of them were forced to leave their homes on the West Coast and move into concentration camps, or internment camps as the government called them, as part of Executive Order 9066. The reasoning given was that as people who practiced Japanese culture, they were a threat to the security of military installations and wartime production plants on the West Coast. So the government forced them from their homes, taking only what they could carry, into barbed wire-surrounded camps in the nation's most desolate locations. 2/3 of these men, women, and children that were stripped of all due process of law were American citizens. When they appealed to the Supreme Court to uphold their constitutional rights in Korematsu versus U.S., the Supreme Court chose to uphold Executive Order 9066. Their justification was that wartime called for unusual measures that sometimes meant the sacrifice of personal rights. Decades after the war was over, though, the Japanese American community led a movement that demanded a formal apology from the federal government. They received that, as well as financial compensation, for those who were still alive from the camps. Even in the middle of a war and dealing with all these minority groups, Roosevelt still had to worry about re-election, especially in the election of 1944. Using the same logic as his previous election, that a change in leadership during the war would be a bad idea, FDR convinced the Democratic Party to nominate him for the presidency again in 1944. The party accepted this nomination, but they said that he had to have a new running mate because his previous vice president was way too radical. Roosevelt and his party agreed on Harry S. Truman, a senator with a great reputation, for the new vice presidential candidate. Roosevelt and Truman then ran against Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, who had a good reputation as a prosecutor of corruption. Roosevelt beat Dewey in an overwhelming margin of over 4-1. However, FDR died less than 3 months after his inauguration, so Truman took over for the remainder of the term. As president, Truman had to make a number of difficult choices, not the least of which was dropping the atomic bomb in Japan. His leadership during the last years of the war and beyond brought America into a new era of post-war prosperity and increased cultural clash.